Hello, I'm Father Wesley Evans from St. Stephen's Episcopal Church here in Sherman, Texas. We're continuing our series on Christian angelology. And today I want to talk to you all about a fascinating group of angels called the Cherubim. Cherubim are really cool because they appear in a few places that it's not that late for me, but they appear in a few places that you might be surprised, even outside the Bible. The cherubim are sometimes also called tetramorphs. Okay, because they have four variations, four forms, okay, a tetramorph. And the cherubim first appear, in terms of the Bible, going from Genesis to Revelation, they first appear very, very early. They appear in Genesis. Genesis 3:24 says, God drove out the man from the east of the Garden of Eden, and he placed a cherubim with a flaming sword that turned different ways to guard the tree of life. It's the first instance we have of cherubim being listed, back when Adam and Eve in the story of Eden were removed from the garden. Now, the reason that this is so interesting, and we'll get more as we talk a little bit more of the verses, is that notice that the Bible does not describe the cherubim. It does not explain what the cherubim are. It doesn't say anything about them. It just says there's a cherubim. It seems to assume that the readers would know what a cherubim was, right? I mean, if I'm writing a story and I say, and then the wizard turned the corner and he ran into a Zorgbog. You say, well, what's a Zorgbog? But if I don't describe it, then I must be assuming you know what it is, right? If I'm writing a fantasy story or something, right? There's some assumption there. If I just use a word, you should know what the word is. So when the biblical writers use a word and it doesn't describe it, there's an assumption that the people know what a cherubim is. So they already knew this idea. All right, well, that's Genesis, okay? So let's move a little bit farther. Let's move to Exodus, because Exodus has cherubim even more. The second place the cherubim appear is Exodus, which commands them to build a tabernacle, okay, so a big tent, all right, where the Ark of the Covenant, which is God's presence, God's throne, perhaps. In fact, that's important that it is perhaps very much God's throne. We'll get to that, why that's important for cherubim here in a minute. But where God resides, he resides above the cherubim, okay, where on the throne, the Ark of the Covenant. All right, and when he does this, God says in Exodus chapter 25, starting at verse 19, make one cherub at one end and one cherub at the other, of one piece of the mercy seat, i.e. the top of where the ark is, okay? And make the cherubim at its two ends. The cherubim will spread out their wings above us for shadowing the mercy seat, etc., etc. Later in Exodus chapter 36, verse 25, it talks about the person who made this, and it just says he made the curtain in blue, purple, and crimson yarns, and he skillfully wove cherubim into a tapestry, what would become the temple veil. Speaking of, little footnote there, it does say cherub. Remember that I think of the last video or the video before, we talked about the ending eem. Ending eem is very often plural in Hebrew. So it's one cherub and two cherubim, one seraph and two seraphim. Unfortunately, in later art, a cherub got turned into these cutesy little baby creatures, which look nothing like the cherubs in the Bible. All right, but speaking of what do they look like in art, that's an interesting question to me, because if we look at this passage in Exodus, notice again, it does not say what the cherubs look like. It assumes that they know. Not only that, it assumes the artist knew, right? God says, make a cherub, okay? Make two of them. Make a cherub, and the two cherubim will have these wings and all, okay? Well, the artist has to know what this is, right? So the Bible doesn't describe, by Exodus, does not describe what they look like. It assumes the readers know, okay? So whatever a cherub is, must be something that already in the minds of people exists. They must be able to imagine its form in some way, shape. Now let's look at the other two things that happened in Genesis and Exodus. In Genesis, the cherub guards the Garden of Eden, guards Eden itself, the tree of life. It has a protective function, okay? Guards some sacred area. In Exodus, if the Ark of the Covenant is God's throne, then what are the cherub doing? They're upholding the throne, okay? They're upholding God's throne in sort of he's king above there, and the cherub are on this throne. Remember those two things. Because when we get into Ezekiel, now Ezekiel is the weird one. Ezekiel is when things get get a lot trippy, okay? The Ezekiel's the one that has the wheels and the wings and the eyes and the wings and the eyes and the wheels, and they're all spinning, and he describes the cherubim in everything, and they are not little cutesy baby with little wings, right? These are terrifying, weird creatures that are animal human hybrids with wings. I mean, it's really like something out of a Lovecraft novel. It really kind of is. I'm pretty sure that Lovecraft couldn't have even thought of something quite this much. In fact, most of his comments were like, it's a cyclopean blasphemy, and Ezekiel's like, no, let me tell you what this looks like. It's crazy. Okay, these cherubim are absolutely wild. All right, go ahead and they appear in two places: Ezekiel chapter 1 and Ezekiel chapter 10. When this video is done, go ahead and look over them. I'm not going to read those verse by verse for you, but we are going to talk about them. And in the first vision that Ezekiel has of these cherubim, calls them living creatures. They have wheels beside them. Each one has a body in a human form, and each one has 4 faces. They have calf hooves and all this other wild stuff. Okay, there are 4 faces. All right, what are the faces? He describes them as being, in verse 10, as being a man, a lion, a bull, and an eagle. A man, a lion, a bull, and an eagle. All right. Now, from the way he sees this, the way it's described in Ezekiel, each face is facing one direction. They seem to be facing the cardinal directions, because he says when the cherubim move, okay, and there are 4 of them. All right. So let me back up a little bit. There are 4 cherubim, and each one has 4 faces, and each face was one direction. And when they move, he says the faces don't turn, okay? So it's kind of like this moving around, and all the faces, this is the face of the man, it's moving like this. So each one faces one cardinal direction. We'll see that again in Ezekiel chapter 10. Each cherubim seems to be associated with one of the 4 cardinal directions, which is kind of interesting to me. We don't know a lot about that, but there are winds in 4 directions. Maybe they're connected with that. The Bible doesn't really say, but that is an interesting fact about them, okay? And above the cherubim is the Lord, the Yahweh, the Lord of hosts, okay? Hosts, by the way, means armies, and is very often referred to God's army of angels, the Lord of hosts, all right? And so there's other places. It's actually consistent with other passages. 2 Samuel 2:11 and Psalms 104:4 talks about God riding on the cherubim. Okay, God sits enthroned above the cherubim. Again, the cherubim are acting as God's throne. You have these 4 cherubim. It's a giant throne, and God is up here above the temple, and it has these 4 cherubim in each face facing one of the cardinal directions, and God sits upon them. It's God's throne. Very similar in Ezekiel chapter 10, which it takes place inside the temple itself, and Ezekiel sees the cherubim, okay, rising up above it, because the Lord is above it, and he sees the cherubim under there. Now, this account is a little bit weird, because it lists the 4, okay? It does talk about each having similar faces, all right? Excuse me. But the face of the bull has been replaced with the face of a cherub, which doesn't. It's kind of, well, a cherubim has the face of a cherub. Well, that's great, but what does that look like? So it's a little bit unclear. There's been some speculation over why it happens this way, and there are a couple of theories. And one suggestion comes from the Talmud, a group of Jewish writings, and suggested that because the bull typically was a symbol of idolatry, it may have been changed for that reason. Some believe the cherub's face was a boy's face, and the man was an older human. that's possibly too. Again, you see these images of Renaissance cherubs. They're all these little children. I don't think that's what's going on here. I'm not entirely sure. But because, again, a cherub has the face of a cherub. Well, yeah, but what does the face of a cherub look like? And chapter 1, remember, there are four of the faces in chapter 1. A man, a bull, a lion, and an eagle. And then now there's a man, a cherub, a lion, and an eagle. It's not really very helpful in chapter 10. Ezekiel was not very helpful here, but that's what's going on. Either way, there are four faces. And the four faces, if you map out chapter 1 and 10, are all continuing to face in the same directions. Okay, they face based on cardinal directions, and it's consistent each time. I can do more proofing for that another time, but there is definitely something about that. And so the eagle represents north, okay, the lion west, the ox or the bull represents east, and the human face is the south. Okay, so eagle is north, lion is west, ox or bull, or maybe face of cherub, whatever that is, represents east, and man represents south. The human face represents south. And each one seems to be associated with a different cardinal direction. Now, let's take some of these things together, right? We have the idea that cherub protect something sacred, and that cherub and cherubim are a throne. Well, there's some interesting connections with the cherub and other art and images from the ancient Near East. I was at the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, and it was for a special Christian art exhibit, and I'm not going to reference anything there, but as I was leaving, they had some stuff from the ancient Near Eastern exhibit, and they had this giant sort of stone, carving from ancient Babylon, and it had, I kid you not, it was two creatures with wings and human bodies and animal heads, these anthropomorphic creatures. And what do we have in Ezekiel? Anthropomorphic creatures, these weird kind of semi-human with wings and a head of an eagle, head of a lion, whatever. It was these anthropomorphic creatures, and they were guarding the date tree of life. Yes, they were guarding the tree of life from ancient Babylon. There's a lot of similarity between those. In fact, word origin-wise, so etymologically, the word cherubim might come from an old Akkadian word, caribou, which were very common protective spirits in Mesopotamian and Babylonian art. Okay, they're often human-animal hybrid who protected doorways and gates. In fact, we have, in the Biblical Archaeology Review, had a full cover on this. We actually have something we dug up in Arslan Tash from the 9th and 8th century BC, a carved ivory thing decorated with palms. That's the composite image of a man, a lion, a bull, and an eagle. From the ancient Near East, okay? These were common creatures. This is why God doesn't need to tell them this is what a cherub will look like. They know what it'll look like. It's a very common image in the ancient Near East, all right? And also beyond that, we have found very similar things, very similar creatures with a sort of bull-human, animal-human hybrid with wings on top of a throne in the ancient Near East. I've seen another picture of that. I couldn't give a reference if anybody would like to ask, where the king sat on top of this throne. Okay, so here's the cool part. Where else in the Near East, the ancient Near East, might you find an animal-human hybrid guarding something sacred? The Sphinx. Yes, for any of you who guessed the Sphinx, you're right. What is it? It's an animal-human hybrid guarding, well, in this case, the tomb of the kings, right? Where they bury the kings. And in Egyptian religion, the pharaoh was divine. He was a god, essentially. Okay, and so we have the Sphinx is basically an Egyptian cherubim, is what it looks like. I can't prove that, but all signs pretty closely point to things like that. Because again, the cherubim, the Bible doesn't say what they look like, right? I mean, not until Ezekiel. So it assumes the people know, which assumes it's a common image. So Genesis and Exodus seem to assume they know what it is, which means it must be something we can find in archaeology. It must be a common symbol or image. And we do find it. We do find human-animal hybrids. In fact, we found one with the exact same four pieces as what Ezekiel describes, doing the same stuff, guarding sacred places like the Garden of Eden, the date tree of life, the Great Pyramid of Giza. Okay, we find them on thrones, right? Being a throne for a king or a lord, like we see in Ezekiel, with the Lord lifted high above the cherubim, sits on the cherubim. He rides in on the cherubim. He's riding in on his throne, on his chariot. Okay, God has it's a description of God, the Almighty King, coming in on his chariot from the clouds, leading his armies. Okay, the Lord of hosts. All right, all that very, very similar. It's basically the same kind of stuff. All right, so that's really cool to me. Basically, that you can kind of find, these cherubic images all over the ancient Near East, and the Sphinx may be one of them. Now, later in the Bible, in Revelation, they appear again. Revelation 4, 7-9, it talks about living creatures. It does not use the word cherubim, but it says, quote, "The first living creature is like a lion, the second living creature like an ox, the third living creature is the face of a human face, face of a man, and the fourth creature like a flying eagle. 4 of them have 6 wings and full of eyes around the inside. Day and night without ceasing, they say, Holy, 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 the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. And whenever the living creatures give glory and thanks, one seated on the throne, who lives forever and ever." It's exactly what Ezekiel saw. It's the same vision of the same creature, the same image. Okay, these cherubim. Again, another reason this Renaissance thing of these small little, these infants with wings is kind of ridiculous. They're weird, strange, terrifying creatures in the Bible. The Babylonian carving that I saw at the museum, they had these giant spears. Okay, these freaky heads of eagles with 6 wings, very muscular guys with spears, and there were 2 of them guarding the date tree of life, so nobody could get there. Very similar to the story of Genesis. They are powerful creatures who guard sacred stuff and uplift God's throne. In Christian theology, they're traditionally seen as the angels closest to God. They're the highest, most powerful level. In fact, if Ezekiel 28:14 refers to Satan, and we'll talk about that if I do something on demonology, if it refers to Satan, then Satan was a cherub. It talks about him being a cherub in the garden. Okay, so very much powerful up there. They're associated with royalty, with power, with wisdom, with speed, with guardianship, with protection. All right, they're unique in terms of that kind of thing, and they are direct servants of God's throne. In fact, in Pseudo-Dionysius' Celestial Hierarchies, which we talked about with the first Angelology, that this is something I'm going to quote somewhat frequently, they were said to, quote, "have the power of knowing and beholding God, their receptivity to the highest gift of light, their contemplation of the beauty of the Godhead in its first manifestation, and they are filled by participation in divine wisdom." So they're the highest level, and everything else flows out from them. In later Christian art, before the Renaissance ruined it, not that I have strong opinions on certain art periods, I suppose, but at least, and even through the Renaissance, this held true. And in some churches, you will find this still. The 4 cherubim are also associated with the 4 evangelists. Matthew is associated with the man, Mark with the lion, Luke with the ox, and John with the eagle. So the 4 writers of the Gospels were associated symbolically in Christian art with these wild, highest level, powerful, angelic creatures. Right? So that's the cherubim. They appear in Genesis. They appear in Exodus as mentioned but not described, which reads as if it assumes that people know what they are. It appears in Ezekiel, and he describes them, chapter 1 and chapter 10, as having these terrifying creatures with eyes and wings and wheels and 4 heads, 4 faces, right? Described in Samuel and Psalms, God rides upon them and he leads his armies into battle. In Revelation, they're the 4 creatures closest to God's throne who worship God day and night. And then in Christian theology, Christian tradition later, they are said to be the highest ranking angel. And eventually symbolically associated with the 4 evangelists. What happened in later art is that over time, and I'm not an art historian, so at that point my expertise sort of fizzles out. They got associated with these small baby creatures, sometimes just called cherubs. So if you see those in Renaissance art, you may call them cherubs. If you use the word cherubim, or even one cherub, please be referring to the angels in the Bible, which are wild, crazy, beyond the imagination of Lovecraft level and they are because they represent this power that God has, okay? This absolute otherness that God is. God is absolutely transcendent. So even his servants, right? Even his servants are scary and wild and just completely, absolutely different because God is so much higher and so much more powerful. That's why it represents God's throne. I mean, imagine you have creatures with eyes and wheels and wings and heads and faces who can fly in any direction, who are these terrifying things. And what does God use them for? His personal servants to carry him around. That's why the image is so powerful, right? They're meant to look very powerful and very other because God is so powerful and so other. So that's the cherubim. If you have any more questions, please comment below. Please be sure to subscribe to this channel. And please come visit us some Sunday. 9:30 a.m. Is our worship time. And so visit us on Sunday, St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Sherman, Texas, 401 South Crockett. Thank you very much, and God bless.